Okay, welcome everyone and a very good evening. Studium Generale Groningen welcomes you to this lecture. It is part of the University of Groningen and the Hansa University of Applied Sciences and organizes innovative and multidisciplinary activities in the fields of science, culture and society. And all the programs in the lectures, films, debates can be found on the website, and if you haven't already, you can subscribe to the newsletter. So for tonight, my name is Lisa Herzog. I teach political philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy here in Groningen, and I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Jessica Frazier. This is part of what we hope will become a tradition, namely that once a year we invite a speaker who will talk about philosophy from outside the classical Western canon. This is a thing in philosophy that Europe and the Western world for a long time took itself to be the center of the world a little bit. And when I studied philosophy, for example, it was still mostly the story that philosophy started with the ancient Greek thinkers and then it went up to the present, only in Europe. But that's, of course, a very parochial and biased picture. And there are lots of thinkers outside of the Western canon. And I think it's fair to say that worldwide at the moment there's increasing awareness of all these other interesting ideas that can be found in other traditions. And there are lots of efforts to bring different philosophical traditions in dialogue with each other. So today we're very happy to welcome Dr. Jessica Frazier. She's a lecturer at Oxford University, teaching in the theology and religion and philosophy faculties. She holds degrees from Cambridge and Oxford, and her first book explored the phenomenological perspectives found in two radically different contexts, so speaking of dialogue, namely Europe and India. And she's continued to draw on these two traditions of philosophical thought, exploring their approaches to the nature of the self, ontology, and value. She's a frequent contributor to media on philosophical and Asian themes, and has quite a number of forthcoming books, so look out for what will be published soon. I'll name a few. Modern Sublime, Gadamer on Being, Beauty and Globalism, The Philosophy of Ultimacy, and Being in Indian Philosophy. So today we very much look forward to your lecture on the self in Indian philosophy. We'll have about 45-50 minutes of lecture, and then, as you probably all know, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Annelies from Studium Generale has the mic and will come, and so we'll have time for questions and answers until 9:30, and then we'll end with that. So welcome with me, Jessica Frazier.
Make sure, can everyone hear me fine? Yes, wonderful, nods, perfect. It's really lovely to be here. Thank you so much to Groningen University, to the philosophy faculty, and to Lisa. There's nothing nicer than in the middle of your life being asked to leave and go be somewhere else and be someone a little bit different for a while and feel this freedom of speaking to new people. And so this is a really lovely opportunity to do that. Thank you all for coming. I'm very grateful to see so many people here. So I'm going to tell a story today about one of the key ideas that we find in the Indian tradition of philosophy. And it's a key idea, I think, that has been of concern in India for about 3,000 years. There is a very early hymn in the Vedas, these ancient texts in Sanskrit that we still have. And in this very early hymn, there's one line where the writers of the hymn are calling to the gods and asking for help. Very similar to ancient Egypt, to ancient Assyria or Babylonia, or a lot of what we find in the Hebrew Bible. They're writing hymns to the gods, asking for help, asking for blessings. But in the middle of this particular piece of writing, the author, whoever they were 3,000 years ago, stops and says, I wonder who I am. What thing I am, I do not know. My mind wanders, wandering. I feel lost in this world. There's a sense that people wanted to know what they are, and that life itself, as we experience it, isn't just a thing you're doing. Oh my God, I woke up again today, I have to figure out what to do again today. Life is a mystery. and something that requires us actually to think about it and to actively notice the strange, amazing phenomenon of being conscious, of being aware, of waking up, of having the power to decide each day and each moment what you do, who you are, what you care about, how you act. So the story I want to tell about Indian philosophy isn't just about India. It's a story about whether or not we notice our lives and all that they involve. And more, as we'll see, it's also a story about whether or not we use them to their maximum potential. So we have the title, The Self in Indian Philosophy, Puzzles and Possibilities for what it is that life can be. And in some ways, the different traditions of philosophy I'm looking at are asking some of these questions. Are you just a ghost in a machine, to borrow this classic image? Someone who is stuck inside your body, trying to get it to go where you want to go? Are you a self-driving car? You're on automatic all the time, simply following the routes that you're expected to follow? Are you alienated from the world around you as this tiny little individual in a big confusing world in an uncaring urban desert? Right? This is one classic image of the modern self, that we are these solitary, lonely beings trying to figure out where to drive the car next. Or are you a non-existent thing, not really there at all, a kind of a dream or a program waiting to be wakened up, wiped away, and liberated? There are whole traditions of thought, there are whole traditions of religious practice, meditation, etc., which are in some cases meant to free you from yourself. There are ancient texts that say your personality, your mind, even your body is something that you should be able to take off, like an old coat, when you're done, and then you'll be free. Right? There's a tradition that says that. And there are traditions that ask you to do something a bit more constructive. Are you an artist of possibilities, of different private ways to be for you and your own self, of global ways to be, shaping the world around you and other minds and culture, even the historical way that the story of the world can unfold? Right? Are you aware of your place, not just in the little story of today or the big story of your life, but in the story of history itself? The third option is what I'm going to be focusing on most. Those particular traditions in Indian thought that say you're not only a little creature in a body trying to steer your way, you're not only a brief and transient dream, some flickering in the circuits of the brain. What you really are is a center of possibility. Right? But these philosophers also want to say we don't always notice, we don't always make the most of that. In some ways, this idea is going to be a little bit in contrast to one version of what the West tends to tell us. So at least from Descartes, arguably from Plato, who uses the image of a chariot. Plato says, what is the soul? The soul is like someone in a chariot. And the chariot is running along like this, and the passions, your desires are the horses pulling the chariot, and you have to get control of it again. That image of the self, kind of, again, trying to get control, trying to figure out where we're going, is something that has rolled on through Western history. If you jump forward to René Descartes, who in many ways is using Platonic ideas, famous for cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes' idea that I think, therefore I am, I'm a thinker inside my body, looking out at the world, helped to make even stronger this sense that we are isolated within our bodies, that the self is kind of hidden behind a veil. I'm here, you're there. I'm in my body, the world is outside of it, and they're two separate worlds. Right? Descartes' ghost, if you like, is something that the West has inherited. And it increases our sense of alienation, our sense of disempowerment, our sense of distance from the world if we're not careful. It can even contribute to what people sometimes see in the modern world as a kind of a victim self, the sense that the world is against us, that we are the ones receiving time and nature and the influences around us, and we're being constantly bombarded day by day. The mind is kind of depicted as a monad, this individual little light all by itself, a lamp in the storm, seeking protection from the external world. We can see it in Descartes and Pascal, Blaise Pascal as well. Nietzsche, Sartre, Camus, the French existentialists, have this strong sense that we are lonely creatures struggling against an angry world. And even Freud, and to some extent Jung, certainly Freud has this idea in the beginnings of psychology that the main thing the human is doing is trying to negotiate nature. And nature is frightening, nature is harsh, nature is demanding, and we're frightened of it. So this sense of a tension, a fight almost between who we are and what the world is something we find coming up again and again. And people talk about it sometimes as connected to a sense of increasing anxiety in the modern world, that we need more therapy partly because there's more anxiety, more fear, more sense that we're alone in a hostile world. This is one of the areas in which people have sometimes looked east. Not sure which direction east is in. Look to east, I'll look over there. Right? A sense that there's a possibility of another way of thinking if we find another tradition of thought. Right? So what is the question there? Are there other places that we can go to inherit a different understanding of who we are? This is the idea that became very popular at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. Actually, it was there even earlier in the Enlightenment. But here's one particularly interesting person expressing the idea that India can give us help. So this is a quote from Max Muller. Max Muller was a German Sanskritist. He was part of this tradition that they have in Germany of studying languages, all the classical languages, brilliant scholarship. He learned Sanskrit, he found it interesting. He was offered a job in Oxford. He went to Oxford to teach Sanskrit. And of course, Oxford at that time was not only a scholarly university, it was effectively the center of British colonialism. It was the place from which India was being ruled, and a number of other countries as well. And they had a real vested interest in having Sanskritists and people studying the countries that they were ruling, explaining the countries to them so they could rule them better, and also often depicting them as inferior. Right, needing to be ruled because they weren't good enough. So Max Muller went over, in theory, to participate in this colonialist project. But, and he's not the only one this happened to, the more he read the text, the more he thought, actually, India's brilliant. India's full of brilliant ideas. India has things to say that we ought to learn. Other cultures are an exciting resource. There's tons of possibility here. And so he wrote this in his lecture, What Can India Teach Us? If I were to look over the whole world to find out the country most richly endowed with all the wealth, power, and beauty that nature can bestow, in some parts a very paradise on earth, I should point to India. If I were to ask under what sky the human mind has most fully developed some of its choicest gifts, has most deeply pondered on the greatest problems of life and has found solutions of some of them which well deserve the attention of even those who have studied Plato and Kant, I should point to India. And if I were to ask myself from what literature we here in Europe, we who have been nurtured almost exclusively on the thoughts of Greeks and Romans and of one Semitic race, the Jewish, may draw that corrective which is most wanted in order to make our inner life most perfect, again, I should point to India. Interesting that he wants to use India to correct the picture of what one particular philosophical tradition needs to remember, maybe has missed, right? So there's a sense that different philosophies, different cultures can form kind of companions. You may be a genius, but if you miss one particular idea, you need someone else to show it to you. Well, that's good, because they may need you to show them something in turn. And so there's a sense of complementarity, of the usefulness of talking to other cultures and finding out what you might have failed to pick up. So he's pointing to that. But he also does point to this idea that the inner life is perhaps something that needs more attention in the Western traditions. India does spend a lot of time thinking about the inner life, about the mind, the self, about in this moment what your experience is. And there are different reasons for that, but one of them is very simply one text, the Yoga Sutras. I don't know if anyone here does yoga. I'm very bad at yoga. I can't touch my toes. But it's interesting, but it has this huge beneficial impact that I'm very aware of. And if you go back to the first text, the first piece of writing that really sets out what yoga is about, originally, it's not about physical activity at all. It's not about your body. It's not about stretching. It's not about physical health. It's about the mind. It's about meditation. So a little bit of Sanskrit here. Why is India so good at thinking about the self? Well, the Yoga Sutras, the first line is Atta Yoga Anushasana, which means now we're going to have instruction in how to meditate. Yoga originally means to meditate. It comes from the Sanskrit verb yuj, which is linked to the English word to yoke, to harness. And what are you harnessing in yoga? You're harnessing your own mind. Remember that image of the chariot? You're harnessing your thoughts and your passions, your desires, your worries, even your body, and getting them to start to lead you where you want to go, not just where they take you. So that's why the Yoga Sutras say, first thing we need is instruction in how to meditate as the tool. The next line says, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. What that means is yoga, which we already now know means meditation, is the nirodha. Rod is linked to roll in English. The nirod is the stopping something from turning. What is it stopping from turning? The vrittis, the changes of chitta, which is consciousness. Yoga is the cessation, the stopping, the slowing and stopping of the wheel of consciousness, which is always running moment by moment. If you've ever tried to have a completely still mind, it's not easy. In fact, sometimes the harder you try, the more your thoughts start to run away with you, right? And this is something they realized already 2,000 years ago and are trying to help us cultivate a way to get around it. Two more things it tells us, and this is the key to what's distinctive about the Indian approach to the self. One is that if you don't take control of your thoughts, they will take over you. Right? So that's the third line here at the bottom, actually. Vritti sarupya itaratra. Itaratra, if you don't get control, then vritti, the changes, sarupya, will have the same form as what you are perceiving and thinking and experiencing. So what it actually means is the self will have the same form. If you don't get control of your mind will simply consist of whatever impressions are coming in moment by moment. You wake up in the morning and you're worried about what you're having for breakfast. And then you figure out what to get dressed in. And then you go get the bus or whatever. And then you think about what you've got to do. And then you can spend a whole day merely devoting your thoughts to whatever is the next random task that comes up. Maybe none of which you really care about all that much. Right? The Yoga Sutras are very aware that most of the time it's our thoughts that are defining us, but we're not defining our thoughts. Right? So it's asking us to be aware of that sense in which, I think of this, sometimes I wake up and I get halfway into the day and I think none of the thoughts I've had so far today are really the ones I meant to have. Right? I was worried so much about this email and that email that in fact I'm failing to control and determine what I consist of, because of course your thoughts are you. Right? The middle line gives us an alternative way forward, though. If we do meditation, says the Yoga Sutra, then, drashtu swarupe avastanam. Drashtu, the seer, swarupa, in their own form, swa as in the Latin sua, your own, rupa is form, in your own form, avastanam, can stand. Sta is linked to stand in English. Avastana, to stand rooted in something. If I do meditation, the true person I am, the person seeing all my thoughts, not the thoughts, but the person seeing them, the person who's witnessing them, will stop being in those silly thoughts about the bus and the breakfast and all these other things, the emails, and it will stand in its true nature, what it really is. this whatever this strange being we are, that is able to experiencing things, to develop desires and hopes and wills and dreams, right? That is what we're supposed to become. So that's our bit of Sanskrit for today, right? But we've got these 3 lines that indicate to us that there is a possibility, not only of noticing that our thoughts are running away with them, but holding on to them and doing something more, stilling them and being who we are in a way that isn't losing ourselves in the banal and trivial parts of life. Mircea Eliade, who was a great Sanskritist, a brilliant thinker, an interesting guy, was one of the first Westerners to study yoga. And he wrote a brilliant book called Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom. And in it, he describes yoga as techniques for autonomy, tools we can use to autonomy, to take back ourselves and our control. He says, really, the Indian tradition is about facing first a danger. Most of the time, we're like this, completely at the mercy of our associations. Man allows himself to be swept hither and thither by an infinity of disparate moments. Under the appearance of thought, there is really just an indefinite and disordered flickering, fed by sensations, words, and memory. So my students, sometimes I can say to them, what did your day consist of? And they'll say, I can hardly remember. It was just a bit of this and a bit of that, and just thoughts that came and went, nothing really significant. The tradition is trying to address that. And Eliade says what meditation is trying to do is give you an alternative possibility. He says the first duty of the real yogi is to think. That is not just to let himself think, right, in a passive way, or whatever thought comes, I'll take it, sure. Rather, to think actively through focused consciousness, you can gain a genuine will. That is the power freely to regulate an important sector of biomental activity. And what he means there is that most of the time I'm letting my desires dictate to me what I care about. The duty of the yogi is to take control and now decide what I want to care about, decide what I crave, decide what I feel strongly about today. All of this depends on an idea that the self that we are is not just this little passive lamp looking at the world. Sometimes Descartes' idea of the self is referred to as the Cartesian theater, as if we were an observer sitting in a theater looking out at the world. But the thing about being a member of the audience, hopefully this may change later if you ask questions, but is it is quite passive. The world is coming at you. I'm talking at you. And Descartes' image makes it sound almost as if you are meant to be passive in your own life. But this is about changing that and saying you are someone who can shape your life, and that starts with shaping yourself. Deciding what you think, what you want to be, what personality you want to have, what you want to care about, what you're excited about, where your energies go, all of it, almost like a sculptor shaping. This involves a number of different steps. Finding who your true self is, we'll talk about this more. Activating your true self, if your everyday personality is taken over your thoughts, but actually you underneath want something else, you need to activate your true self. You might not even remember who your true self is. In some traditions, you might then want to destroy that self, be free of the ego, let things happen, but to do so mindfully. In other traditions, though, you might want to recreate who you are. If you don't like who you are all the time, this says you have the capacity to recreate it. And this is going to involve something that neurologists talk about. There's a notion that the brain, however it works, a lot of it is kind of very straightforward. You shine a light, it responds to the light. You give it a bit of food, it responds to the food. You say something, it responds. A lot of the time, the mind is reacting simply as a straightforward machine where you give an impulse and it responds backwards. And yet the mind isn't just that. That's what's curious about the brain, is that with all of this simple biological activity happening underneath, there's also what they sometimes call the executive self, or the executive agency. It's a strange phrase. It makes it sound like a CEO in a company or something like that. But you're going to go with that image. The self who looks at all the things your mind is doing, deciding how to sit at each moment, regulating your breathing and your thoughts at each moment, keeping back certain memories, bringing forward all these different things, regulating attention. There's a part of your mind that is controlling all of that, right? Balancing it. It's the part of your mind that kind of sits on top and watches what's going on inside of you and decides how to manage it. That's the executive self. It's kind of the decider. It's the manager. And in the text we'll look at, it's depicted almost as the king, as the sovereign, the one who is really ruling you, and not just the everyday parts. You can look at it in a kind of a neurological way. If consciousness is something that emerges from the body and the mind, there is at some stage a point where the lower self, that's thinking, oh, tasty cake, splits from the higher self that thinks, I don't need any more cake, and decides to put it away. Right? That split of yourself that happens whenever, every time you negotiate your own desires and thoughts and control yourself or moderate yourself, your executive agency is coming into action, your sovereign self. And you can make it even stronger by giving it a heightened awareness of what's going on, by strengthening your sense of control and power, by increasing that executive agency. So more and more, you're able to decide what you want to do. If it's ever been a cold day and you thought, I'm going to go for a walk because I'm going to do it anyway. I really want to do that. You know, even though it's cold, that is something I'm going to do. That's your executive self coming to the fore. So a lot of these traditions are about trying to increase this side of your mind. So it maps in that way onto the neurological side of things. The question then is, what happens if you do this? What kind of self do we discover who's not just the you responding moment by moment, it's the you who has this larger oversight? Well, in ancient India, they tried to find that self, starting in around 800 BC, by doing what they thought of as a deep dive, a kind of a special search, not outward, but inward into our minds. We have this sense in the early sources that the self is a puzzle. As with that hymn that I gave you from the Rig Veda, there's a sense that who you are is a mystery. What are the layers of yourself? If you've ever had that, people talk about code switching sometimes. If you've ever been one person with this group and a different person with this group, if you've ever gone to a party and, oh, that was really fun, and then you come home with your family and you're like, oh, I can relax. And then even from your family, you go into your room and you have a quiet moment alone, and now you can really relax, right? And then you're thinking and all your thoughts and worries come, and then when you get to finally, you even get out of this, you're going through different levels of the self. So there's a sense of a kind of a deep dive inward. And people started to ask in ancient India, what is the most basic component of you? What is the bit that if we go down deep as we can, we find that is really the core? So India went beyond just analyzing the mind and the self. It actively employed a practice of radical epoché. This is a phrase that you get in phenomenology, this tradition of thought, which tries to analyze our own experience. Radical epoché means pushing away the bits that aren't important, right? You're bracketing, you're unwrapping the self until we can get to what we find at the core. In this sense, yoga was a kind of phenomenology. Phenomenology is associated with Heidegger, Husserl, to some extent Descartes as well. It's the practice of trying to understand your own experience. It's almost like a strict science of looking within rather than looking out. But unlike Western phenomenology, which just tried to describe your thoughts, Indian phenomenology wanted to change them. So there's a greater sense of looking for tools for alteration, for control. So it actively stripped back the functions of the self to see what was left. This is one of the earliest texts that tried to do that. It's from a text called the Chandogya Upanishad. The Upanishads you can find in any bookshop often. They influenced Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Hegel and Walt Whitman and Thoreau and all kinds of people. They're very beautiful texts. In the Chandogya Upanishad, which is about 800 BC, one of the oldest texts we have from any living tradition in literary form, it says this: Now here, it has this idea of the body and the world as something called Brahman, which is the whole of everything. And it says here in this fort of Brahman, meaning the body, there is a small lotus, a dwelling place, and within it a small space. Indian early thinkers had noticed that the heart looks like a lotus. And they kind of thought this was interesting. I mean, actually, you can kind of see it in the image. They thought this was interesting. And the way that a lotus can unfold made them think maybe the heart can unfold. And what will you find at the center? They felt there was a space. What's in that space inside your heart? In that space, there is something. And that is what you should seek and try to discover. That's what you should seek to perceive. What is that mysterious thing inside the core of the lotus of the heart? Now, the people writing this don't know what the brain is. The people writing this don't understand neuroscience. All they know is that there's a feeling of some core in your body where the true you resides. But it's not something we're aware of very often. But that, they said, is important, and it's what you should try to find. This is from a different Upanishadic text, the same genre, where they start to think about thought. It says, you know, the funny thing is you can see everything in the outside world, but you can't see the seer who does the seeing in your mind right now. You're seeing me, but you can't see who it is who's seeing. You can't hear the hearer who does the hearing. You're listening to me right now, and you can hear me, but you can't hear the person who's hearing. You can't think of the thinker who does the thinking, and you can't perceive the perceiver who does the perceiving. The text says there's a mystery here. In all your life, you're constantly taking in information about the outside world, but you're not taking in information about who it is who's having that information, who's having those experiences. So again, it's trying to turn you back to think about your own mind. And this is the last of this genre that I'll put up from the Katha Upanishad, which is influential on Buddhism and the Bhagavad Gita. It uses the same image as Plato used, of the soul as a rider in a chariot. Know the self as a rider in a chariot, and the body as simply the chariot. So your body right now is just the chariot. It's the person inside who matters. Know the intellect, your intellectual mind, as the charioteer. It takes control. It decides what to do. It decides when to leave and when to come and what time to leave to go to the lecture. But it's only the charioteer. The mind is the reins. So your mind is also working out what to do, how to do it, what time does the bus come? Oh, talking a lot about buses, but you're thinking, planning out all of these things. The senses, they say, are the horses, and sense objects are the paths around them. The senses, they're a little bit worried about. The senses are what I'm trying to focus, and then I see a really good piece of cake. And oh, my focus is gone because the senses are pulling me over there. Oh, disaster, right? So it says, be careful of the senses. They're important, but they can distract you. He who is linked to the body, senses, and mind, the wise proclaim as the one who enjoys. The person who is really able to enjoy life is the one who is linked here, literally as yoga, yuj, yoking, harnessing, the person who's able to control your body, your mind, your rational reasoning about things, your desires, and even what you're focusing on at each moment. That's the person who really is enjoying your life, and who, if you do this better, will enjoy it more. This is one of the texts that started to try and figure out what the answer was. What is it that we are? It's from the Aitareya Upanishad, and it starts off, who is this self? That is how we think. Again, it's a very old text, about 2,500 years old. Which of these is the self? Is it that by which one sees, or hears, or smells odors, or utters speech, or distinguishes between what is tasty and what is not? Is it the heart and the mind? Is it awareness, perception, discernment, cognition, wisdom, insight, steadfastness, thought, reflection, drive, memory, purpose, will, love, desire? Look at how many different parts of the mind it's found. You can see that people, just to even have this kind of vocabulary of different aspects of your mind, already The whole of the Indian subcontinent was full of people going out to meditate. They're sitting often outdoors under the shade of the tree in the twilight when it's cool enough to do so, and they're carefully noticing their own mind and trying to take apart, almost like mechanics disassembling a car so they can understand it better, pulling out all these different parts, your intentions, your will, your desires, your awareness. It says, but these parts are still just various designations of cognition. They're just parts of the car. This particular text says knowledge is the part that really matters. Knowledge is the eye of all that. Knowledge is what allows you to really decide how to put the car together and where to make it go. And on knowledge it is founded. Knowledge is the eye of the world, and knowledge is the foundation. So you're doing the right thing to go to lectures and fill your minds with knowledge, because actually the text says that's what's going to help you to take control, to make sense of it. Not just to put the car together, but to drive it somewhere. This phrase that we saw briefly there, Atman, means the core self. Actually, in contemporary Hindi, if you go to India, if you watch an Indian film, it just Atma, it's just the self, just oneself. Just in the way that I can say, who's going to drive the car? Me, myself. Right? In the ancient texts, it also meant your core self, maybe your soul, the true you that is the one that you find if you unwrap all the layers. Now, what are the things you can do with your core self if you find it? One tradition was interested in trying to deconstruct and indeed even kind of destroy the core self. So there's a phrase that we find in Buddhism which is an-atman, non-self. And there's a huge amount of literature written on this. In fact, most people looking at the philosophy of self are focusing on what it means to deconstruct, to take apart the self, to take apart the mind. And the goals in Buddhist meditation were to get free of the ego, to identify the ego and its different ingredients, conceptual thinking, desire, and agency, as something you can dismantle. In some ways, Buddhism was really aware of the ways that we can become a false self. Here I am, Jessica Frazier. Someone shows me a photo of the childhood me, and I think, am I now who I meant to be? Am I now who I really intend to be? Right? And so Buddhism is quite sensitive to the dangers of getting lost in whatever person you've ended up becoming and failing to take the possibility of escaping from the limits it may put upon you. Partly because it was interested in escaping from suffering. So it wants to end the storm of fears and desires that come with your current identity, to disperse the process that is the self. It's a bit like a tornado. It's a storm. If you can slow it down, it will disperse. And you'll be free of this person, this story, this life that you're in. But I want to kind of end by thinking about a different tradition that we find in yoga, in India, in Vedanta, and certain particular groups who wanted to think about the self's capacity for creation, the self's capacity for power and agency and discovery, what is sometimes called an imaginal self. There are a lot of texts that were interested in the way that the mind is able to create reality, not just to take in what it gets each day. So I won't read all of this, but it's from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads, one of the oldest texts we have from any philosophical tradition. It says the self has two places, this world and the other world. We don't know quite what it means by the other world. But it says there's also a third, the place of dream. The other world seems to be a transcendent world beyond the physical, but the dream is the place where the two meet. Standing there in the place where the two meet, we can see both those places, this world and the other world. And that place, your dreams, your mind, your imagination, serves as an entryway to the other world. It's interesting because it says this. It's interested in assessing dream. It says this is how he dreams, yourself. It takes materials from the entire world and taking them apart on his own, and then putting them back together, you dream with your own radiance, with your own light. In that place, this person who you are becomes their own light. It sounds very cryptic and mysterious, but it's noticing this. When you dream, the outside world comes into your mind. You take what you need from the outside world, and you reassemble it in a new form. You create worlds in your dream. Your mind alone creates whole worlds, adventures, people, realities, journeys, beauty, horror, all of it. You are a creator as much as anything else. And it says this in the last line there. The self, even though in your mind there are no roads and places, the self creates for himself joys, pleasures, and delights. In that place in your mind, there are no pools, ponds, or rivers, but the self creates for himself pools, ponds, and rivers because it is a creator. Whatever is in you has a fundamentally creative nature that we see in dreams. There are a series of different Indian texts that explore this idea. There's one called Yoga Vashishta that looks at all reality as a dream. It's a bit like the Matrix or something. There's another text that looks at the way new personalities can exist even within a single mind. And there are Buddhist stories that look at the way in which we can even take apart the self we are and become other people, or act for other people rather than ourselves. Compassion's important. If you've ever been a parent who realizes at some point, if the car was coming down the street and was about to run over your child, you would happily take their place. In some gut level way, someone else's body is more important than your own. Right? This is an interesting insight because it also shows us that you're not stuck in your own self. You can shift so that other selves, other bodies, other people, other things are more important than you. Arguably, you see that in any soldier who fights for his people and is willing to give up his life. You don't have to even be stuck in yourself. You can expand your concern. So this leads us to the final point, that you get to make yourself what you most want to be. While India can be reductive about the self, seeking to dissolve or dissemble the mind, it can also be constructive and proactive about the self. And you see this in certain traditions. And some examples. People have started to write about this more and more. There's a philosopher called Michel Foucault, controversial in some ways, but interesting and important. And he reminded us that in every philosophical tradition, there are ways that we make ourselves who we are. He pointed out that if you don't actively make your own identity, society will make it for you. So there's a reminder that actually it can be important to take control of who you are. And a lot of this is about this sovereign executive self coming forward. When the self pulls in its mental functions, this is all from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, then the person is asleep. And wherever you travel in your dreams, those regions become your worlds. In your dreams, you can appear to be a great king or an eminent priest, to visit different regions. And just as a great king taking his people with him may move around his country at will, so your mind, taking the different functions of thought with you, moves around your body and all the worlds in your dreams at will. There's a power in you to direct yourself, where you go, what happens, and what you care about. The challenge was to bring that out of your mind and into the waking world. In the epics, so this is from the Mahabharata, there's a story about a female yogi who goes to a king, and the king tells her that she has no power, she's unimportant. And she shows him that, in fact, he has. She reminds him that he himself really is there not to serve his own desires, but to serve the nation, to become a self who is expanded to the good of other people. So it's a story that tries to remind the king that actually his responsibility is not to give in to the ego, but to be aware that he's made up of all these different parts, and that he needs to make sure that he's not only thinking in terms of the parts of his body, but the parts of the country. In Ayurveda, which is Indian medical philosophy, and some of it's just straightforward medical science, there's also a really positive image of the self as something that you can try to make healthy, to make strong. If a lot of yoga was about deconstructing the ego, Ayurveda was about making the ego strong, not in the sense of giving in to all its desires, but in the sense of being a strong, positive, autonomous, kind of a king, but over your own being. And it says, here in the self, in the person, in who you really are, This is where action, consequences, knowledge, delusion, happiness, suffering, life, death, ownership, everything comes from. There cannot be light, darkness, truth, falsehood, scripture, auspicious and inauspicious actions if there is no active and aware person. If there's no self at the heart of you who's awake and alive, nothing else will happen. So it's really about taking this notion of the self as the controller and creator in your imagination, in your everyday life, and making it stronger, making it better, making it more reflective about what matters. So it's not your body and mind that are controlling you, it's you who are controlling your body and mind. If you look into Indian thought, there are different ways it tries to give you tools for doing this. They include theory, understanding the mind, dispassion, not losing yourself in your passions, practicing. It's very hard to practice. Every time I try and do yoga, I do it for 2 days and I give up. But actually that continuous practice is needed for you to get control. And also, go backwards. And also focusing, inner focus. Also separate understanding. Understand that what you desire and what you decide to desire are not the same thing. Making the line between things you don't even notice so that you'll see that new things are possible. And then putting yourself back together through aggregation, bricolage, recreating yourself from the parts of you that you do like and want to be, and leaving out the parts you don't want. And absorption is an idea that you find, making sure you pattern yourself on the right things. Pattern yourself on people you want to be. Fill your life with things you do think are good and that you want to be like that, and you will become more like that. If you focus on things you don't want to be, you can become assimilated to them, right? So you need to be aware of that imprinting, that absorption into what your thoughts are. And that can lead you to become a sovereign self, a self that is in control of itself and makes you who you want to be. So you wake up in the morning and you're not lost in the flow, you are controlling the life that you have. And just as a last point, you can apply this to political, social, ethical questions as well, right? If the self can be what it wants to be, I'll come back to this, but you can make yourself larger or smaller. This is an interesting insight. You can be a little you, and that's the me that I am when I wake up in the morning and I think, oh, yeah, oh, God, I'm really worried about, I forgot to do the laundry, I forgot to send that email. Oh, those little things in my local life are controlling me and containing me. But I can also stop. I can spread my concern. I can say, no, wait, those are the small me. What's the big me? The big me is concerned about who are the people I love, what do they need, what is the bigger thing I want to do today, what are the larger concerns I care about, what is the bigger story of my life, not just today and breakfast, but like everything I want to be and become. Let me expand myself to be part of that larger self that is possible. This affects the ethical world. So this came up, I was born in the US, although I've lived in England almost all my life. It's an interesting time to be an American citizen. And there's an interesting speech from Vance. I'll just kind of put the thought out there, where he makes a claim about what your ethical responsibility is. If it's focused on the small scale, your family, your local community. If you should really deprioritize the large scale, your society, your world, your environment, history itself. In a way, the Indian material wants to say you get to choose whether you care about the small or the large, right? Don't let anyone tell you. This is actually open to you to decide what's the scale on which you want to live. The Bhagavad Gita, I won't go through this, but the Bhagavad Gita tells us we can do something called loka samgraha. Grah is to grasp. Samgra is to grasp, hold together. Loka is the word for world. You can decide if you want, if you're a good yogi, to hold the world together. It says you will be like a king if you do that. To take it upon yourself to be the person who creates life and goodness for the world, you become almost part of the mind of the world, the mind of history. We can see people kind of trying to choose ways to do that. This is an interesting puppet that was created to represent, I think, a Syrian refugee. And they created this huge life-size puppet with people in it making it move as a kind of a message about investing in the larger stories of the world. But it's a reminder that you get to choose what you care about. Society doesn't dictate it for you. And again, it doesn't have to be what's in front of you. It can be the bigger picture. So the message really is that in the Indian traditions, you're not merely someone stuck inside a little theater, someone in a car that's driving you where you don't want to go, someone who has to be the self that society gives you. You can be a self-making self. You can look around you for different sources and inspirations. You can decide what you most want to be. You can take apart the parts of yourself you don't like and are stuck in, and you can reconstruct yourself better. With your sovereign self, this part of you that gets stronger the more you use it in making those decisions. And you can even become a world-sized self, not stuck within your small concerns, but open to larger ones. Actually, India thought that was a good solution to a lot of the problems of life. Don't get lost in the little, engage in the large. So the message is take control, get creative, and shape yourself. And if you do that, you are shaping the world, because you are not, in the end, only you. You are part of a larger life. And this is the wider message that these traditions are trying to give. So hopefully, that's a little message about certain ideas we can get from the Indian world that are meant to give you tools to take away so that when you wake up tomorrow morning, you have the capacity to say, oh, let me first decide what I think, and then pursue that into who I want to become. Leave it there.
Thank you very much for this incredibly rich lecture, from historical texts to how we can think about ourselves. A very positive story, I guess, and also probably a demanding one, but I'm sure there will be lots of questions and reactions. Please show your hand, and we have a mic that can go around. Let me start with the first. Oh, there's already one. Perfect. Can we start over there, please?
Thank you for the lecture. I think it's great that this kind of knowledge is being shared more. If you have one book you can recommend, what would it be? If that's a question that's possible to answer.
That's a good question. That's a really good question, actually. Damn, I wish I'd known. I would have prepared. It'd be like, haha. It depends what you're interested in. I'm going to give you a kind of what in England we'd call a cheesy recommendation. Sentimental, and I've already mentioned it earlier. There's not that many books which are easy accessible. You read the Yoga Sutras if you want to know about meditation, and there's plenty of books on meditation which are good at giving you a sense of how it works. If you want to read a book about the journey towards trying to think about the self, there's an old book called Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, which actually, weirdly, my parents had it on the shelf and they gave it to me. It was a kind of a thing that everyone read in the 70s or whatever. He's read the Upanishads. He went to India before writing it. It's actually not bad. It has an interesting angle on what it means to pursue in your life, above all things, a journey towards the self. So part of me would say that one.
I see a hand over there. Two hands, actually, so we can take
hands.
both of them in
One
a row.
moment, I have to. I have a running nose. Oh, sorry.
And then I saw your hand.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, thanks again for the presentation. But my question is, so how did the society that created this idea of you can be your own maker, in sense you are your God, how does that coincide with a society that has a caste system that works on the opposite side?
Yeah, good question. And this question often comes up. Like, you're all these wonderful philosophical things, and then how do you get this social reality? I think, I'm afraid most societies did. So I think some of this is about the realpolitik, right? I think at the time when British Romanticism was becoming most florid in the idea that you should pursue your passions was exactly when society was most repressive, in the class system in the UK, which actually was not that much different, and similarly ruined lives in many cases. I think also, though, that it's interesting if you go back and read the texts in India that recommend caste kind of identities. They're really into locking down the self. They really say, when you wake up, do this, and then you should eat this, and then you should do this ritual, and you must wear this, and this is how you should relate to everybody. It's absolutely about creating a kind of a cage around your thoughts and your body and everything. And what they don't like is people who are sitting there just going out and doing yoga. So it's almost like two tensions that were kind of at loggerheads in the society. You know, it's a bit like saying you've got, in medieval Christianity, you've got some people who are about like, here are the laws and the rules of how you have to behave. If you don't, you'll go to hell. And over here, you've got Meister Eckhart saying, oh my God, God is bubbling up within you and being, you know, excommunicated or whatever. So that sense of tensions between freedom and social lockdown, I think is something you get in every age and in every culture. And I think it's a bit like this.
I would like to challenge you a little bit on a statement you made about Anatman.
Go for
So it was a reaction. It was a reaction to Brahmanic tradition. It was probably a reaction to Upanishadic tradition. He just practiced with ascetics, right? And left. It was probably a reaction to Sankhyan tradition to some extent. And he doesn't negate Ahankara. He negates Atman. He does not negate the ego. He negates the self, which we can to some extent correlate to Purusha if we start talking about Sankhya. I think it goes deeper than destroying your ego. I think it's well, there are two ways of understanding this, right? Either it's a ontological negation of the self, but the self, not just ego, right? Basically, well, let's call it soul, but it's of course a bit of a lousy translation. Or it's a soteriological proposition. I don't know if self exists or not, but you believing and chasing it is the source of dukkha, right? How do you understand, and would you agree with me that it's actually deeper than just destroying the ego in the ahankara sense?
Yeah, good. So two parts to my answer. One is you're right. I was just saying, I'm always a little hard on Buddhism because it's, because there are parts of it that are, I think, come from a period in Indian history when the main concern was suffering, dukkha. And it was trying to find a way to get out of that. It's a lot like Stoicism in some ways, in certain phases. So it's doing anything you can to escape from suffering, and sometimes it's a bit negative about the world as a result, right?
So is Patanjali.
Just to fit, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, but just to observe that actually you're right, there's a much bigger picture there. I'm not sure that he leaves ahankara. We can talk about this later. I'm not sure he leaves ahankara. I mean, actually, I think you can find places where it explicitly says, get rid of ahankara.
Can I ask you to let her finish the answer first?
We can have a chat about the historical details later. So I think that's complicated, but I think you're right. Even if Buddhism initially is quite cautious about the self, over the 2,000 years of flourishing, many different traditions come out of it, many of which are very positive about the self and life and all of these things. So yeah, absolutely.
So we have lots of hands up now. The young lady here next. Yeah. I'll try to keep track a little bit, but we will...
Hi, good evening. Thank you for the lecture. I study international relations, and one concept that keeps coming up is this idea of sovereignty and its many negative implications. So something that I'm looking into is exactly whether the notion of there being a sovereign self is beneficial to understanding how we relate to each other and therefore also how states. So I wanted to ask if you see a difference in the control that you were talking about in this lecture, of taking control of yourself, versus this other way of controlling, if there is a difference indeed, when it comes to sovereign states or notions of identity that then clash with other identities.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you're right. There's a danger that if you say, oh, you're autonomous, you're free, you can take control of yourself, you become a little monad again. You become something locked within yourself who doesn't have to care about anything else. You become self-sufficient to the extent of isolation and a kind of false sense that you're actually not connected to anyone else. I think it's a good point. And I think a lot of these sources I didn't have time to go into the Ayurvedic one, but one of the things they say is you are in control of the self, but you're always linked by threads of perception, of thought, of culture, of feeling, of emotion, of love, of just your physical body to the physical world and to other people. It's not that you can become completely free. It's more that you have the capacity to use your power for the whole, right? So the Loka Samgraha idea says, don't use it says the ignorant man is the one who uses his sovereignty to only please himself. Too much ego. The wise man is the person who uses his sovereignty to make the whole thing better, right? Who expands the sense of self and actually realizes that you are already part of a larger reality, which is the globe, which is nature, which is society, and which is history. So I think, yeah, there's a sense in which that power is there to connect, not to disconnect.
Thank you for the interesting speech. I was thinking about the contrast that I found in how the self is in India with some of the recent things that I've been reading into, both in philosophy of mind with forecognition, which is bringing the focus more from the core self and looking inwards to a bit more outward perspective, but also in more contemporary commercial thinkers like Sam Harris, that there's nothing to really look for inside, but it's more outward. And of course, now we're talking about India, but do you have any thoughts on that contrast?
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, one thing I want to say about this notion of the sovereign self, it's something you find in Buddhism, Hinduism, and all the different schools, regardless of whether they think there's a soul. So even if you don't think there's a soul, there's like a core light in the middle of you. It says, even if it's just part of your mind, the part of you that is able to control and decide and make decisions, assess situations, make judgment, form values, and move, that part of you is there no matter what. We don't know what you are exactly, so different kind of versions of who you are, even with Sam Harris, if there's no soul. That part of you is still there. We see it all the time. It's just that sometimes it's weak and sometimes it's strong. And I think this philosophy is saying, good, strengthen it, but you don't have to keep it inside. You can take it out. You know, the parent puts their self into their children a little bit. There's also a nice connection to aesthetics. When you watch a play or watch Netflix or whatever, yourself goes into the characters for a while. When you weep as if you were someone in that story, you've become someone outside yourself for a while. When you sacrifice yourself for the greater good in whatever way that involves, you're giving yourself to a larger self. So I think part of what we want to bring out is this sense that it's not necessarily in you. You can put it in different places. There's a connection to possession traditions I won't get into now, but there's all kinds of beliefs that you can really send yourself out into different worlds and actually engage beyond the body, as it were.
We have a question in the first row here, and then we'll make the way to the back. Wait for the mic, please.
In the middle, you said somewhere, and I read also something like, the self is more or less, our self is more or less thwarted by power and fear. I think that are the two elements, and we can recognize in ourselves, searching for ourselves. But I wonder, and that self, that's a very personal thing, but can you also say that it's on a bigger scale, like even you could say like the world, because at this moment, I think fear and power are two elements that somehow we cannot cope with. We cannot cope with in ourselves, but also not in the world. Can you say something?
Yeah, that's a lovely, lovely insight, absolutely. One thing that they notice almost above all is that fear and desire have an incredible power. They're just like twice as loud as everything else that's in your mind. And if you can show people something to desire, if you can whip that up, you can think about capitalist consumer society, all kinds of connections, that will overwhelm everything else. All the other stuff goes quiet while that takes over, while you really want that piece of cake. Same with fear. If you can get people to invest in fear, fear is the loudest sound. It's the brightest color. It will quieten everything else in your mind and take over. And that's actually why they're dangerous. That's why one of the most important things is to learn to calm that and escape from them, because you won't even know what else is possible if something is shouting fear or desire and power at you. So I think, and you're absolutely right, seeing that as a social, cultural, and political voice is something that should be equally, we should be equally careful about.
Maybe you can continue over there. Sorry, yeah.
Hello.
You, and then at the very back. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question relates to the lotus heart comparison. So, which was a very simple example of an observation of an expression of nature leading to some sort of deeper insight. And after studying chemistry, I've been seeing sort of examples of, the scale of nature that chemistry is on, and then insights that lead on from that. And I was wondering whether you had any other examples from Indian texts of expressions of nature leading to, philosophical insights.
Yeah, that's
off the top of your head. You might maybe not, it doesn't prompt anything, but yeah.
That's a really lovely question. And actually, there are things. There are a lot of things that aren't just to do with the self. So maybe if you email, I can give you suggestions that are more to do with trying to understand the world. They were interested in chemistry, and I can't give you anything off the top of the head, but maybe I can say this. One of the things they love about nature in this tradition is the way that what you see isn't necessarily what you get. They don't understand why when you put this and this together, it gives you a new effect. They don't understand why if you leave the juice there, it turns into something intoxicating. Why would the apple juice or whatever, the mango juice, become something that intoxicates you madly? They don't understand the chemistry of alcohol, but they know that there are hidden realities there. And even that image of the lotus with a secret inside the heart, you can take out a heart and you're like, oh, what? That's what kept that person going so long. They don't know what it is that's doing it. They were fascinated with breath and the way that when you stop living, it stops. They didn't understand what it is that it's doing that's so important. Same with blood. But in a way, nature gives a reminder not only that it's good to look at nature, but also that nature is full of mysteries and powers we're still trying to understand. So yeah, it's kind of a semi-answer.
We can continue here in the middle.
Here.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. I'm curious, you were mentioning how we are not the observer, or we are the observer, and we're not in a theater and we have an agenda, and you were also mentioning that we are our thoughts. But from Buddhist principles, I think that I know that we are an observer in that theater, literally in a theater, and we are not our thoughts, we're not our actions and stuff. So how do you make sense of both? How do both exist?
Yeah, good. Yeah, good. And in a way, I kind of rushed through that, but I think you're right. And the Yoga Sutras, which are also a bit there at the beginning of Buddhism, would agree. They'd say, be careful. If you do not control your thoughts and stop them from running away with you, you will. If you do that, you will only be your thoughts. If you don't control them, if you don't stop in the morning. My aunt said to me, I stop in the morning, and before I get up, I read a chapter of a book. And I thought, my God, I can't imagine having the luxury to do that. But eventually I started doing it from time to time, and it gave me time to not run with my thoughts. So it's more that the Yoga Sutras are saying you are your thoughts unless you do the work to push them aside and give space for the observer, right? It's not saying you are only that, you have to be that. It's saying precisely that you need to make sure you don't end up only the TV screen, as it were, right? That's not ideal. So yeah, I agree with you.
Hi. At the back? Yeah, this is amazing because my question is a follow-up to this question, I think. So my question goes more like, if we are always trying to take control, this assumes kind of that we are the agent to ourselves. And this assumes like a lot of notions about freedom that I think all the Indian traditions share, which are like own agency. But I think it's very interesting, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the notion on how this tradition seems to be very individual, but not very individualistic, which is a pretty different thing.
Yeah, that's a lovely, yeah, that's good, yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, it also took some time to decide where it wants to go with this, and just maybe from that perspective, if you read early texts about the first yogis, the first people going out into the wild, the ascetics, the wilderness men, some of them were quite individualistic. They were like just going to find liberation for themselves. They're escaping suffering for themselves. And all through India, there's a wave of this. And actually, you can see it. There's stories about parents going, oh my God, my teenager's going out to find themselves. They don't care about the family. What are we going to do? But over a time, 100 years, maybe two, you start to see stories about people going, no, 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 I went into the forest. It was great. I liberated myself. But I don't want to give up on the world. You see it in Hinduism, where texts like the Bhagavad Gita specifically say, don't give up on society to find yourself when you're needed. Don't give up on your family, whatever it is that's important. Don't give up on that just to pursue your own individual liberation. Rather, create this individual strong self so you can use your freedom for something. Right? People talk about negative freedom and positive freedom. Isaiah Berlin talks about this in political philosophy. Freedom, which you're free, but you have nothing you want to use it for, is not great freedom. Freedom where you're free, and what I care about is this, and now I'm going to devote that freedom to something. That's what we're looking for. Buddhism does it as well with the compassion and the bodhisattva ideal. So yeah, absolutely, it's very much a freedom that in the end, they want to say, use it for something. Don't just flee from the play. Take over the play and make it a good play, if that makes sense.
Here?
Hello. Yeah, it was a very beautiful lecture. Thank you lots. So I have a very specific question about Foucault, because it's super interesting that you mentioned him, because he happens to be my favorite philosopher, let's say. And you said it in the context that either the world writes yourself or you do write it yourself.
Yeah.
And from the bunch of books by Foucault that I read, I think he tends to be a little bit more on the pessimistic side, if I should call it like that. Because apparently, there is nothing else than power. I think he goes to quite extreme, and anything that we can think of or even feel is already programmed by the power. So I was first thing was the book, the picture you put there. I was interested what book there was, and the other part of the question is maybe which book kind of explores this sovereignty more, even if it exists in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Michel Foucault is famous for doing these, particularly 3 books where he looks at how the medical system, the criminal justice system, and the sexuality, the morals of sexuality, all are ways to control you effectively. And they do a good job. They control not only your body, but your mind. Arguably, later, Foucault, he looks like such a pessimist. Society is controlling you, society is controlling you, society. Oh, what do we do? I don't know, it's all power. Arguably, in later sources, there's a series of, I think, lectures on technologies of the self, where he says, well, it's not that all power is bad. If you have power to shape yourself, then it can be good. It's still a self you're making, but actually it can be a positive thing. And he inspires Pierre Hadot in Philosophy as a Way of Life, which is nice to read as well, where he says philosophy was originally a way for you to shape who you are. It's a paintbrush. It's something creative. So I think a little bit that later technologies of the self lectures and a bit of how Hadot plays with it, maybe.
So it's like a collection of lectures.
Yeah.
Technology of the self.
Yeah. If you Google, you'll hopefully find it. If you have trouble, email me.
The libraries over there, they should help you. The lady over there, and then the gentleman behind, yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for a very insightful lecture. I have a very short but an interesting question. I want to know what you think about it, how anatman, destruction of self, kind of manifested itself in Hinduism, because we know that one of the 3 main gods, Shiva, is the god of destruction. I just want to hear your opinion about it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, good. Yeah, so you do get parts of... So Hinduism basically decides that suffering is a problem, but it thinks that rather than destroying the ego as the source of problems, source of desires, you should find the deeper self. And that deeper self will be free of the ego problems and so on and so forth. So we see Atman. Having said that, it also leaves, and so Shiva is the god who represents the yogi, right? That's why he's always depicted. I don't have a picture of him, but he's usually depicted covered in ash from his campfire, for he lives in the wilderness, with the Himalayas behind him, with a begging bowl because he doesn't have a job. He lives on whatever he can get, in lotus position, usually sitting in meditation. He represents the yogi. And I think in that sense, he also represents that you're supposed to let go of a lot. To be able to, to be able to have control over yourself, you might have to kill a lot of the parts of you don't want to be. I'm in that phase of my life where I'm having long chats with my mum, and I realize how many bad habits I have, how critical I can be, and how I need to rethink some of my habits and my assumptions and my whole picture of the world and my triggers, and actually that's useful. That's important. I do want to kill those parts. I need to let them go. It's not always easy to dig down deeper, and I think there's an element of destruction there. We have to be quite bold sometimes in being able to do that. And in a way, all the Indian traditions also want to say, one day you'll have to let go. At death, or in the different forms of death, where you have to change your life in some way, you often will have to let go of who you were. So maybe it's good practice to get good at it and learn how to turn those big changes into a realization of freedom and not just of like mourning the old you, as it were. So yeah, an element of destruction there as well.
Gentleman behind, yeah.
Thanks. So many of the ideas you talked about are, of course, found in Hinduism, also Buddhism. Great that the previous question also touched on it. But I wondered, so why call it Indian philosophy instead?
Oh, sorry, why call it Indian philosophy?
Instead, like you titled the lecture for tonight, Indian philosophy, right?
Yeah.
Why not call it Hinduism or Buddhism?
Oh, I see. That's a good question, partly because I don't think it's linked to any one of... If we use those words, all these words can mean many things. If we use those words to mean particular religious traditions, these ideas, I think, are interesting partly because they cut across all of them. All the traditions used yoga. Yoga is one of the things that unites Jainism, Hinduism, but even Islam, when it came to India, started to incorporate in the Sufi traditions bits of yoga, Sikhism. Everyone who gets to India picks up this tool because it's so useful. And so in some ways, I want to think of it more as an Indian philosophy, and it's more than just Indian, because it's now global in a way, and take it out of the idea that it necessarily is tied to any particular religious goal, if you see what I mean. Because those religions did different things with it, but the tool itself is actually open to you to decide what to do with it, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for the lecture today. So my question is, say from Upanishads, Aham Brahmasmi, like I am Brahman, to say Bhagavad Gita, Vasudeva Kudumbakam, like the whole world is family. So do you think like when putting in timeline, it evolved looking, towards self than to looking outside? I would like to know your thought about that.
That's lovely. That's a lovely insight. Yeah, so you quoted an early text, I think it was Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, very early, like 800 BC, where it says, I am the divine. But it's really focused, I am discovering my true nature, and I will be the Lord of the world. By the time you get to the Bhagavad Gita, which is maybe 500 or more years later, there's a stronger sense that, again, you can't leave behind your family and community. You have to do what's good for them as well, as seek your own liberation. And the whole world should be seen as your family, not just your actual physical family. So there's a real expansion of this ethical sense of responsibility. Why? I think different reasons. India had expanded, so internal empires had expanded India's sense. You no longer are just aware of your tribe and your village. You're aware of the kingdom, of the cities. People are suddenly aware that there are mountains in the north and seas in the south. So there is a bigger picture, that geopolitically, if you like. And maybe a shout out to Buddhism. The Emperor Ashoka Maurya, this important empire from around 300 BC, united bloodily, but he did unite a lot of India into a shared nation. And once he did, after shedding lots of blood, he said, now let's be peaceful. And he set up what are called the Ashokan pillars. So I think it's on the flag of India, or certain symbols of India, you get this pillar. And he wrote on it, we should all follow Dharma, which he used to mean good order, right ethics, responsibility for all. And he demonstrated it by planting trees by the roads, building good roads, planting fruit trees so everyone would have things. Basically trying to create a positive society with a sense of shared positive responsibility. And in doing that, even when his empire fell, for centuries afterwards, Hindu thinkers also started to say, you know what, he's right about that. We need this larger sort of communal ethics. So it's both naturally evolving out of Hinduism and also responding to other people who had said, you know what, we need to think bigger and maybe more socially from now on. Yes, there's various things, but those are some of them.
Well, maybe that's a good note to end on. The hope that there's a possibility of developing towards the social. Let us thank Jessica Frazier very much.
Thank you, guys.
Let me also thank all of you for coming. As you know, there will be more slides, and if you want to leave feedback on the lecture, here's a QR code. This is a Dutch version. You'll also get an email if you've registered, and that is in 2 languages. So do leave your feedback, do give your thoughts. And we hope to see you again at other Studium Canadale events. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you've taken some inspiration, some thoughts for yourself and the bigger self. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Much appreciated. Take this bit off. I think I'm right. Oh.